Peace of Christ be with you. In this episode, we are explaining the greatest sin in Catholicism. What is sin? In Catholic theology, sin is understood as an offense against God, a rejection of His love and law. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 1849, defines sin as an offense against reason, truth, and right conscience. It is failure in genuine love for God and neighbor caused by a perverse attachment to certain goods. Within this framework, theologians have long debated the greatest sin that most grievously separates the soul from God. The Church, drawing from sacred scripture, the Church Fathers, and scholastic theology, has consistently identified pride as the root of all sin and the gravest of offenses against God. Pride as the root of all sin. The Church teaches that pride, super bia, is the greatest sin because it is the foundational vice from which all other sins arise. St. Augustine, in City of God, Book 14, Chapter 13, declares that pride was the beginning of all sin. Similarly, St. Thomas Aquinas, in the Summa Theologica, Tatuaun, Question 162, Article 6, asserts that pride is the beginning of sin, because it involves an inordinate desire for self-exaltation, rejecting the divine order and making oneself the measure of truth and morality. Scriptural background. The gravity of pride is evident in sacred scripture. The fall of Satan, Isaiah 14:12-15, and the rebellion of Adam and Eve, Genesis 3:5-6, stemmed from pride, the desire to be like God, independent of His will. Proverbs 16:18 warns, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." Likewise, St. Paul in Romans 1:21-25 describes how humanity, in its arrogance, exchanged the glory of God for idolatry and moral corruption. The 7 deadly sins and mortal sin Catholic tradition classifies pride as the foremost of the 7 deadly sins, a concept developed by early Christian theologians, such as St. Gregory the Great. These deadly sins are not mortal sins in themselves, but are capital vices that lead to mortal sins, which sever the soul from sanctifying grace, CCC 1855-1861. The distinction between venial and mortal sin is critical in Catholic moral theology. Mortal sin requires grave matter, full knowledge, and deliberate consent, CCC 1857. Pride becomes a mortal sin when it leads to a conscious and deliberate rejection of God's authority, manifesting in sins such as apostasy, heresy, and blasphemy. Pride versus other grave sins. While sins like lust, greed, and sloth are grave, they often stem from weakness rather than direct rebellion. Pride, however, is a sin of the will, a deliberate exaltation of self above God. Dante's Inferno places the prideful in the lowest circle of hell, reflecting their obstinate refusal to submit to divine authority. Modern manifestations. Pride manifests today in secularism, relativism, and self-sufficiency, rejecting God's law in favor of human autonomy. The solution. The remedy is humility, exemplified by Christ, who, being in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied Himself. Philippians 2:6-8. The Church calls believers to combat pride through prayer, the sacraments, and acts of humility, remembering that God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. James 4:6. The conclusion: pride is the greatest sin in Catholicism because it is the origin of all other sins, a direct affront to God's sovereignty, and the most serious impediment to salvation. The path to holiness requires its renunciation through grace, humility, and obedience to God's will,